This episode discusses topics that may be sensitive or upsetting to some people. If you or someone you know is struggling emotionally or have suicidal thoughts, please get support from the resources listed on this message or the description of today's episode. Hi everybody, I am Venemous, and this is my hetero life mate,
Titan.
And welcome to Should Unknown Podcast, where we share our life's experiences with you and navigate through life's tough seas together. Today, we're going to be talking about something deeply personal to both myself and to Titan, and chances are very personal to you as well. Titan, what can the audience expect out of today's show?
Well, for today's show, we're going to be talking about the very fun topic of death and how that's affected both of us personally, professionally, and our families. Venomous, as we talk about the topic of death, can you tell me maybe what happened to you? Who did you lose in your life that impacted you?
I've lost quite a few people in my life. I've lost co-workers, friends, and I've also lost all of my grandparents.
I mean, so of those people, who do you think, was probably the hardest, that hit you the hardest?
So,
not to rank your family members or anything, one over the other, but just, I mean, I'm sure there's one that was probably the most impactful to you.
Everyone that I've lost has impacted me a little bit differently, but I am going to loop in both of my grandparents on my mom's side of the family, just because their story is so intertwined. Their relationship with me is a little bit different, and they both had slightly different impacts on me and my life, but you know, they lived together. My experience with them was usually together, so that's why I'm going to kind of combine them together. I know you've lost people too. Who would you say impacted you the most?
Well, for me, I think for me, I have a smaller knit family. I mean, there's definitely cousins and aunts and things, but I wasn't ever really close to any of them. For me, the biggest two that I've lost was my mom and my biological father, but I don't really care that much about him, so that's okay. But my mom, that was definitely the biggest impact to me, because of the nature of how she passed. So
yeah. So let's double click into that. So obviously I know what happened, right? And and I know it's probably difficult for you to kind of go back in time and relive it.
Sure.
Can you kind of tell me the story of what happened, basically the day, right? That you found out, right? Because you found out in a very unusual way that your mom had passed away.
So throughout the week, I had been contacting my mom to try to get in touch with her, because we usually saw each other over the weekend. I would take my small child to go visit, which was fine, no problems, whatever. But she wasn't calling me back, which was weird. She normally would call me back. And on Friday evening, I kind of knew something was up because it had been too long. And so I decided, okay, well, on Saturday, I'm going to take, my son with me, and we'll go get the oil change in the car, because we got to go down that way anyways, whatever.
Yeah.
And I keep putting it off because I kind of knew what had happened. I just didn't want to, face it. So we get over to, we do all the things we needed to do, still no contact from her. So I'm like, well, let's go over there. I have a key to the house. Let's go figure out what's going on. So drive up to the house, and I get my son out of the car because he was 2.5 at the time, and go up to the door, and I call, and I can hear the answering machine pick up. And for those of you who don't know, an answer machine is something that, people used to record, phone conversations on, so they didn't have voicemail.
It's like voicemail, but a machine completely dedicated to that.
Like, exactly. Yeah. With tape and stuff. And everyone can hear when somebody left a message, which could make it awkward.
Right.
Anyways. Yeah. And so I hear myself, and I'm like, okay, well, she could definitely hear me talking, and her car was there. And I'm like, okay. So at this point, I'm like, something's definitely up. I'm not going to take my son in. So let me go put him back in the car so I can at least,
Mm-hmm.
go open the door and take a look. And so I go and unlock the door, open it, and they had this entryway as you come in, and there was a wooden kind of support beam thing there. So taped to the wooden beam was a note to me, and it said, hey, Titan, do not come in, call 911. I'm sorry. And I was like, okay. So I turned around and I was like, you know what? I said, let me go back in. Maybe there's something. And I was like, no, no, no. I said, I've been trying to call for days. Like there's no saving her. If she was, just recently passed, I was like, there's no way. So I walk out, call 911, go through that whole rigmarole. And then a funny story as we drone on through my description, but I think it's kind of funny. So I call my sister-in-law, who lived nearby, and I was like, "Hey," I said, "You busy?" She's like, "Well, I'm playing golf. What's up?" And I was like, "Well, my mom just killed herself, and the cops are going to be coming by, and I've got my son with me. Do you mind coming and picking him up so that it's not loud and a lot of things going on?" And she was like, "Oh my God, yes!" And apparently, she just ran across the golf course. Didn't even take the golf cart. Ran across the
Wow.
course to then come pick him up. And what I think
Jeez.
is funny about it is she was like, yeah, you were just so matter of fact about it. Like, hey, I don't mean to inconvenience you, but can you come
Mm-hmm.
over and do this for me? Like, this horrible thing just happened to me, but I don't want to inconvenience you. And I
Right.
guess that's just kind of my mentality. Anyways, so yeah, so my mom, she did commit suicide, but to me, it wasn't a huge surprise per se because it was something that she always struggled with and fought with.
Mm-hmm.
But it still really, really sucked. So yeah, that's the story.
So,
So
so, so you had, the that gut feeling that your mom had committed suicide.
oh yeah.
And you said that that's
Yeah.
something that she struggled with. Can you kind of expand on that a little bit more? Like, what kind of
Uh,
mental health challenges does she have?
yeah, I mean, I don't know all of the individual diagnoses, but I know she struggled with depression for a long
Hmm.
time. It wasn't, she had tried and to commit suicide before. She's changed her mind, but, for whatever reason, in some of those instances. Um, she had been institutionalized on two occasions, once involuntarily and once on her own. Um,
Hmm.
and I don't know, it was,
How old
trying to
were you
think,
when
here I have to
she
cut some
got
of the pauses.
institutionalized before?
Oh, okay, yeah. So yeah, the first time I was 11, I think.
Okay.
I was like third grade. So it was like third grade. And I remember my biological father, he woke me up and he's like, hey, he's like, I need to take you to the neighbors. I was like, why? He's like, oh, something's going on with your mom. And so um, ended up, going over there and didn't know what happened, right? And then the next day I find out that she had apparently tried to commit suicide.
Hmm.
And the thing that, and what's, I don't need to go into that. I was gonna say it was something that's messed up, but it's not really worth it. So that was when I was 11. The second time she institutionalized herself, I was, I think, like 15, and that was like a
Hmm.
week that she was there. We stayed with a stepdad, and it was okay. We knew she struggled with depression and other
Yeah.
psychological issues. She had a really hard childhood, things like that. And then I remember when I was in the military, I called home one time just to chat, and she was like, "Yeah, I've been researching on ways to commit suicide, which I won't go into, but it was kind of like, that's an interesting thing to tell me."
Interesting. Yeah, that is. Yeah. Why would she tell you something like that? Do you know like why she would tell you anything like that?
No, that's a really good question. I have no idea. I remember thinking how messed up it was, and I told her then.
Yeah.
I said, "I swear to God," I said, "if you do that," I said, "I will never forgive you." I said, "I will be
Hmm.
angry with you forever," which I mean, and is technically true. I am still very angry with her,
Yeah.
but I mean, I've forgiven her because I know that it wasn't 100% her fault.
Hmm.
But in my opinion, that is the most selfish thing to do because you are
Hmm.
only thinking about yourself. And I know that the people that go through this and struggle with it, they can't help it, but they don't necessarily think about how it affects everyone around them who do care for them.
Right.
But it is a struggle that they deal with, and you know, um, yeah, it was definitely tough. And I lost my train of thought. There
How
was somewhere I was going to go with that, but
No, that's okay. No,
anyways,
so
go
I
ahead.
do have a follow-up question on that. So,
Yeah,
speaking
yeah, yeah,
of the impact on the overall family,
yeah.
how did you explain it to your son?
So when he was really little, that time we just said that she went to go live with the stars. That's kind of what we led with, and he was okay with that for a long time. As he got older, and then he started struggling with his own depression. That's when we talked about it, because actually he's had suicidal ideations and things like that. It was something that we discussed with him. Like, listen, this is how this happened, and this is how it affected everyone. And it's something that is very difficult to deal with. So,
And how about your siblings? Like, how has it impacted them?
So that was an interesting thing. I don't know to the detail it affected them, but I do remember informing. So I told my brother and I told my sister. And with my brother, he was kind of in the same boat I was in, as in that it was, again, surprising, but not surprising at the same time. My sister was a different case. She was actually on her way to a concert, and she just got moved to the front row, and it was like a big deal. And so I didn't want to tell her at that moment. I didn't want to ruin her concert for her. So I told her husband at the time, I said, listen, I said, give me a call when it's done. I said, because I need to talk to you. And he was like, okay. And I didn't even tell him because I didn't want him to know either. And so when he called me as they were leaving the show, I told him first because I wanted him to be aware of it. Why is she freaking out or whatever? And so I told him. He ended up passing the phone to her, and then I told her, I'm like, listen, I said, mom's committed suicide, yada, yada, yada. And she just collapsed to the ground, basically screaming. That's how it kind of impacted her. And, the sad thing was she was already booked. She was living in a different state at the time. She was actually booked to fly in for Thanksgiving. This happened near Thanksgiving. And so she was already booked to come in with her small child and stuff. And anyways, I was kind of messed up. And in some ways it was horrible. But the nice part, which silver lining, was you came in to visit. A couple other friends that I'd known for a long time, they came in to visit, to help support and things, which meant the world to me. And honestly, I had a great time. Like, we're sitting there preparing for, I had to deal with all of the arrangements. My stepdad, once he got back into the country, he was a mess. And so he just couldn't, he's like, I'll pay for it all, just set it up. And so myself and my wife at the time went through and basically set everything up, and so that part was all tough. But like I said, you come in to visit other friends and stuff. And what was interesting is I get through things using dark humor, gallows humor as it's called. That helps for me. It apparently also helps my brother and sister and you a little bit as well, because the four of us are just making some awful, awful jokes and we're laughing. But my two friends who I knew from earlier in my childhood, they were like, you guys are messed up. Like, why are you laughing? So I always thought that was kind of funny.
That's hilarious.
But I mean, even today, honestly, because again, it still affects us. And my sister and I will make jokes about it just because it helps ease it.
Yeah, so. Of course. So something that there's something that happened while I came to visit you that got seared into my brain.
Okay. What was that?
You went in to, because your mom, she had an open casket, and you went in to see her.
Yeah.
And you immediately walked back out.
Yeah, that was tough. So yeah, you're gonna ask, well, why did you immediately walk out, right?
Yep.
So I walked in, and now my wife at the time, she actually did her makeup and her hair. My stepdad asked, he's like, hey, it's like, I know, how she liked her makeup and her hair. So would you be willing to do it? And she did. She knew the funeral home director, and they went to college together, or high school or something. And so they'd known each other forever. So he was fine with it. So she did her hair and her makeup. And while she did an excellent job on that, it didn't look like her. So I walked in, I shut the doors, I walked over to her casket. That's the first time I'd seen her since she, had passed. And I looked down at her, and I'm just like, yeah, that's not her. That's who she used to be. And I couldn't say goodbye to that. And so I just walked back out. Because my mom always said she didn't want a viewing. She didn't want a big funeral. She didn't want any of that stuff. She's like, it's a waste of money. She's like, I'm dead. Who cares? But because of the way she died, she lost that right to that a little bit. It wasn't in a will,
Yeah.
so she lost that right to it. So we did have a viewing, and I know for me it didn't really give me closure, but I know for my siblings and for my stepdad it definitely did. So it was definitely worth it from that aspect. But
Yeah, I mean, I see things like that as it's not really for the deceased person.
right,
It's
right,
more for the rest of the family and friends,
yeah,
right? To kind of
yeah,
give them that sense of closure to move on. So it's
right.
been several years since your mom
Mhm.
passed. How has that affected you today, right? Like, do
Yeah.
you still, do you have like dreams about her?
Mhm.
Do you handle different situations in a different way because of the way that she passed? Did it affect your relationship with your son in any way? Like,
Right. Yeah. So it's a several part question.
yeah.
So the way it kind of affects me today is when good and or bad things happen, I miss being able to tell her about them.
Yep.
I recently, a few months ago, went through a divorce. And while everything was amicable, as amicable can be in a divorce, because we were
Mhm.
married for a really long time, being able to talk to her about it, to have her wisdom on it, and just to have that person to lean on, that sucks.
Right.
And, when there's been achievements, career wise, relationship wise, whatever, not being able to tell her again, that's always been the hardest thing. And, with the way that it has me approach certain things is when it comes to like my son's mental health. I don't take it lightly. As soon as he was, having suicidal thoughts the first time, we said, okay, well, you need a therapist, so we got him
Mhm.
a therapist, started that process, later got him a psychiatrist to help with some medications and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then a few years later, he told my wife at the time, he's like, I'm starting to think about doing it. I'm having these thoughts. And so we ended up having him hospitalized
Mhm.
for it was only about 5 days or so. But I think the biggest reason was because he wasn't taking his medications. It's kind of tough. Not a doctor, but I'm going to say what I've seen. What I see is a lot of people who struggle with this. They take medication, it makes them feel better. Then they say,
Mhm.
"Oh, I don't need it anymore. I feel better."
Yeah, then
And
they get
then
off
they
it.
go deeper. Yeah.
Okay.
And because my mom did that all the time, and
Yeah.
for years she would do that, and finally she came to the conclusion and said, "You know what? This is as if I had a heart problem. Yeah, I feel better because of the medication.
Mhm.
I have to keep taking the medication." And that's to me the best way, and it's the way I explained to my son. I said, "You feel better, yeah, but that's because of the medication. Keep taking
Right.
it." And there's also the stigma. People have a problem with that. They think, because some people do. Some people think less of someone because they're suffering with this, and it's not. I don't know. It's not anything to be ashamed of. It's just like any other medical condition.
Yep.
That's the
100%.
way it should be treated, because all it is your brain is not producing the chemicals like it should. It's producing them at a lower level. So it's just as if your heart had an irregular beat, things like that.
Mhm.
So that's how, I take it, with my son. And, as far as my sister goes, my brother, I don't really know how it's affecting him. I know he misses her. I know with my sister, she still struggles with it. I imagine somewhat more in some ways
Mhm.
because she actually looks so much like my mom
Oh my
that she
god,
probably
she
wouldn't.
is like her
Yeah.
mom's clone.
Yeah, which
Oh
I'm
my
sure she
goodness,
would
she looks
not
so
want
much
to
like
hear,
her.
right? But yeah,
Yeah.
but she knows it, right? And so it's actually hurt some relationships for her with other family members who just also had a hard time with it. My grandmother has always had a hard time with it, and it's really difficult because my grandmother would always bring my mom up to my sister, and my sister's like, I don't want to talk about that, and so
Yeah.
they actually don't talk anymore because my grandmother
Oh,
wouldn't listen to her. But and that's her decision, that's her choice,
sure.
and
Yep.
she has that right. But yeah, so that's how it's kind of impacted everybody. I think for my son, the impact, and one of the things I miss or I hate for him the most is my mom was really young.
Yeah.
She wasn't quite 16 when she had me. So she would have been a really cool, quote unquote, cool grandma. She would have
Yeah, right? Yep.
been a good resource for him to be able to talk to about life and issues and things like that. And he doesn't
Mhm.
have that. He still has his grandparents from his mom's side, but they're much older. So they don't, I don't know. Yeah, I guess I will. So he's transgender, so that's something that his older grandparents, while they've accepted him more than I ever thought they would,
Mm-hmm.
they wouldn't
They
have,
just don't
I don't
understand
think
it.
they've accepted as much, especially as much as my mom would have. My mom was
Yeah.
definitely way more open-minded about that kind of thing. But hey, we'll talk more about that in a future episode. So,
Yep. Yep. So if, let's say you could say something to your mom today, right? And
right.
let's say she could hear you, right? And you
Hmm.
could establish some sort of a connection through death, right? And
Right.
maybe she's an angel, right? Whatever.
Mhm.
What would you say to her?
Hmm. That's a really good question. I wish I knew about that question days ago, because that's a tough one.
Take your time.
I think, yeah, I think some things I would definitely tell her is, one, I do forgive her, but I am still angry. I would tell her that life wise, there's ups and downs, but overall, I think things have worked out fairly well for me thus far. Still got some time to go,
Hmm.
hopefully. Don't want to get hit by a bus or anything, but hopefully. And, you know, that I miss her, I guess. That would probably be the last thing. I think that's
Yeah.
probably, what I would suggest. Because, again, I do forgive her. Something, I'm not sure of this, something my therapist recently had me do that I thought was really good, and it did help me. Again, not a doctor, not giving advice, is she had me write a letter to her. And she's like, I was typing it on the computer because I'd rather type than write. And she's like, just keep writing. Just keep writing and writing and writing. She's like, and write until you've said everything you need to say. And what she's wanting me to do is cry. That's what she wanted me to do, because that was the
Yeah.
one thing that I actually thought maybe I was broken. Because when she died, I didn't cry. I didn't cry when I basically found her. I didn't cry the whole time while the cops are interrogating me, basically, trying to make sure I didn't do anything, which they knew they
Right.
didn't. They're just doing their job, but it makes you still feel awful. I didn't cry as I'm setting up all the stuff. I didn't cry until it was after everyone had left. So it was almost 2 weeks later, and we had gotten the notes she had left behind. So at least we had those. And I locked myself in the bedroom and I just read it, and I read it and read it. And I did cry,
Hmm.
but I still didn't cry enough. And I remember telling my therapist, before she had me do that exercise, I said, sometimes I just feel like I'm driving down the road and I will think about her because I want to tell her something, and it does make me cry. And that's when she suggested that. And it worked really well for me, I feel, because I got a lot of things said, granted she won't hear them, but they're said. And then I
Sure.
went for a drive, listened to what I call my happy playlist, and I drove for about
Hmm.
an hour. So just to kind of get out of that headspace. But yeah,
But I think that exercise, I think, helped you just process the loss,
yeah,
which I think that timeline of you finding your mom, right, and then you having to tell the family, which is, I mean, that all fell on you, making
right.
arrangements, right, all those things fell on
Yeah.
your shoulders,
Hmm.
and there's no way that you had
Hmm.
any time whatsoever to sit down and process anything at all.
Yeah, sure.
So I'm not surprised to hear that, you didn't cry for a long time
Mhm.
about it. I mean, 2 weeks, that's a long time, right?
Right.
But
Yeah.
I think it's just because you just didn't have that outlet to really think through it and process your thoughts and process your emotions. And I think that's a really great
Yeah.
exercise to kind of write everything down and just let it out there.
Mm. Yeah. I think the other thing I do want to mention, because, while I did a lot of those things, it wasn't just me. My wife at the time was very much a part of it.
Yeah.
She definitely helped out a lot. I remember, that night after, we found her, and after the cops and the Emmys, they took her away. We had to clean the house because there were like dishes all in the sink, all these different
Yeah.
things.
Right.
And, she helped me with that. And I remember when I picked my stepdad up from the airport after he came, back into the country. I picked him up, and, we're talking and stuff. We get into the house, and I didn't touch anything else. So we did the dishes and stuff because you don't want,
Mhm.
bugs and pests and things, but we didn't touch
Right.
anything else. So the chair that she was in was still there. And he was
Mhm.
like, he's like, yeah, that can go, that can be thrown away. And I was like, okay. So I threw away her chair. I'm the one that carried
Mhm.
it, put it in the back of the truck, drove it to the dump, and got rid of it. So I think I think I think that's always been something that's like, again, I had to take care of so much. But like I said, I did want to give some credit to my ex-wife. She definitely was very much a part of it and helped me get through a lot of those responsibilities. So
Well, it's good. I mean, it sounds like you had a
yeah,
good support system.
yeah, yeah. From that aspect, it definitely did.
Yeah.
Her whole family was very supportive.
Yeah. That's
So
awesome.
uh, well, enough about my sad story. So let's talk about your grandparents. Do you
Okay.
want to share? Because I
Yeah.
actually don't know how they passed at all,
Okay.
so or when. Mhm.
Their deaths were very different. My grandfather was also in his 90s, and he had been having health issues for a long time. In his, I want to say 70s, I want to say, or something like that, he had a heart attack, and it
Okay.
severely impacted his heart, his ability to move around. He
Mm,
was a pretty heavy drinker and smoker all of his
yeah.
life, and he had to give all that up. And um, ever since the heart attack, physically he was not the same ever again.
Right.
And I remember, and this was probably about 3 years ago now, 3.5 years ago, or something like that. I
Hmm.
was in Florida for work, and my mom calls me to basically give me a heads up that he's dying. Because, like, death is if you die naturally, it's a
Yeah.
process,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
especially of old age, right?
Hmm.
I'm sure you've heard of that. And so she's like, hey, he's laying here right next to me, blah, blah, blah. Do you want to talk to him? It's like,
Right.
of course, of
Hmm.
course. So, I talked to him, and you could tell, like, he was not himself at that point.
Right.
But he heard me. I know he heard me. Mom acknowledged that he
Hmm.
heard me telling him that I loved him. So I was able to tell him at least that I loved him that very last time that I talked to him. And I remember I was in my hotel room when I was talking to my mom. And I remember I walked, it was early in the morning. I called my boss, let him know, hey, here's what's going on, da 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 da. And then
Hmm.
after I hung up with him, I walked into the bathroom, hopped in the shower, and I cried.
Okay.
And then my grandma, so his wife, she did not. I feel so terrible for her because after he passed,
Hmm.
we went into the pandemic.
Oh.
So she was living in an old folks facility, an elderly
Yeah.
facility, and people could not go visit her. So
Yeah.
here's this woman who her life partner just
Yeah.
passed away, and she can't even see her family,
Yeah. That would have been
you
really
know?
tough.
And she eventually things opened up and people were able to go visit her. But by
Right.
that time, she had already lost a bunch of weight. Mentally,
Yeah.
she had been declining over time. She had dementia. So she
Hmm.
was forgetting things. And in some ways, her behavior would occasionally kind of regress to when she was a little girl or a younger individual.
Yeah.
And I remember visiting her for when my grandfather passed away,
Hmm.
because that was just before the pandemic broke out. And it was tough talking to her because she would come in and out of time. Like,
Hmm. Yeah.
there were times where she would remember who I was and times where she wouldn't remember who I was. Um, it was definitely
Hard.
difficult to see her kind of phase in and out of time like that. But
Yeah.
I felt lucky that, hey, she's still here. Now we need to step up and make sure that she's okay. Da 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 da. And so then fast forward, right? Pandemic is starting to
Hmm.
settle down. She's allowed visits at
Right.
the facility, and I go with my mom and one of my sisters, and we go we,
Okay.
we go to the facility to visit her. And oh my God, like physically, she was so thin and so frail. It was hard to see her like that. She didn't look like herself at all. I'd
Yeah.
never seen her like that. And, of course, they kind of wheel her out, right? In a wheelchair because she can't, at this point, she's too weak to walk and all that stuff. And she's got her dementia on top of that. So here's these strangers, essentially, that are there to visit her.
Mhm.
Um, but then she would have these moments of lucidity. So she would come in and out of focus, basically.
Right.
And so she would get talkative, and then all of a sudden she would stop talking, right? And her attention would go to something else. And she would kind of stare off in the distance. And
Oh man.
because she was so out of time, in her
Right.
mind, she was asking about people that had already passed away. So she was asking about her siblings, many of
Mhm.
whom have already passed away.
Right.
And so that was difficult. But the one of the last times that I saw her, dude, bro, like it just totally, it's this feeling that just cuts through your chest,
Yeah.
and you just feel like the wind is completely knocked out of you. And I was trying to hold it all back. Well, I did. I held it back until after they had taken her away in the wheelchair and she
Mhm.
couldn't see anymore. And I was walking back to the car with my mom and my sister. My mom knew, right? Like she immediately knew
Right.
that I was, basically being a little bitch.
Yeah, because you're a big
And
baby.
I'm a big baby, as we've been able to establish already. And yeah, so that, so dude, like, yeah, I was, they say Kevin Smith cries a lot. I think I can debate that at this point. But yeah, man, I just totally, like, yeah, it was hard. The last time that I saw her though, I got it out of my system, right? I felt like
Yeah.
okay, and then we left, and it was still super sad, but yeah, and then a few months after that, come and go, and so they had put her on a feeding tube at that point because
Mm.
she wasn't eating on her
Right.
own anymore,
Yeah.
or allegedly. Like if you ask my mom, like she's got her own thoughts about the whole situation that may have led
Right.
to her passing, and she she ended up with what you call it, your lungs fill up
An
with fluid. What is
infection.
that called? Pneumonia.
Oh, pneumonia. Yeah.
Is that what it's called? Pneumonia, when your lungs
Pneumonia.
start filling up with
Yeah.
the, yeah. So they so she ended up with that, and I think she, to me, based off of the timeline of events, she got it from the feeding tube, because apparently that's a common thing that happens. If you're in a feeding tube, the food can actually get into your lungs
Mm-hmm.
and cause that to happen. And she
Yeah.
had, by this point, she was too frail
Fight it
to
off.
get beyond it. Yeah, yeah. So anyway,
Yeah.
and that's basically how she passed away.
And so, and that obviously was fairly recent then. I mean, in the last, what was that, 2 years ago?
Yeah.
Okay. So then it's a very fresh feeling, you know. So let's talk about, like, how did that impact you after the fact? Like, what did, you know, how was the, services, things like that, for her, and what did you do to try to get, to go through the grief, the stages of grief,
Yeah.
with losing, both of your grandparents in a fairly quick, succession like that. Um,
Yeah. So that entire time was weird, right? Because you just touched on it. Both of my grandparents passed away. In the meantime, my partner's grandparents were passing away too. So it was one
oh
of those
man.
things where one of my grandparents would pass away, and then one of her grandparents would pass away. So I
Yeah.
feel like the last 3 or 4 years has been nothing but dealing with death, essentially.
Right.
And the service for my grandmother and my grandfather,
Hmm.
they were really nice. There were open caskets and people were able to come in. My grandma was able to choose the dress that she would
Hmm.
wear. when
Right.
she was buried. So she was, and again, she didn't quite look like herself, but
Right.
she looked like an angel.
Oh,
I
yeah.
thought that for what it was, right? I thought she looked like an angel.
Mm.
And my grandfather, he was a World War II veteran, so he got buried at the veterans uh, um, cemetery in Puerto Rico,
Okay.
and they did a whole service for him, with military honors and stuff like that. And oh
Oh, cool.
my God, talk about
That'll
emotional
make
when
you
they come
cry.
out with that trumpet. Oh my God.
Yeah.
And of course, they asked for somebody to say a few words, and I just wasn't ready.
Mm.
I couldn't
Yeah.
get up and say anything. And then with my grandma, I handled it a little bit differently. I kind of, as emotional as I was able to gather to because I already went through it with my grandpa. Now I know,
Right.
okay, I know what they're, I know what the process is now. I wasn't quite as overwhelmed. And so I was able to sit down, get some thoughts on paper. And so I kind of delivered some words um,
Yeah.
when they, because she also, because she's a spouse of a veteran, she also had the same benefit of being buried
Right.
at the veterans cemetery. So
Oh. So one thing I wanted to ask you, and do you think that maybe the reason why you came to acceptance faster with your grandmother is also because you saw her basically declining so rapidly, if you will, over that time when
yeah,
you were able to start seeing her, because do you feel like you're already starting to make your peace with it to a certain extent? You didn't want to, but
yeah,
because you already kind of seen it. So,
100%, a
so
100%.
yeah.
Because my grandfather, it was, you find out one morning that he is in the
Hmm.
process of passing away. Then a few days later, he's passed away. And then
Right.
you're making arrangements to hop on a plane and get there and all that type of
Yeah.
stuff. With my grandmother, you're right. I had much more time to sit down, process it, and be in the
Mhm.
correct kind of mental space to, put my thoughts down on paper and deliver
Yeah.
it was a eulogy, I guess.
So, as you're going through that, and you also said, that your spouse is also dealing with her grandparents passing at basically the same time. Did you find it difficult because you didn't have her? Like I said, I did have my ex-wife at the time to kind of lean on a
Mhm.
little bit. Were you able to, or because she was also dealing with it, you both were just kind of grief stricken through it?
So we helped each other get through it. The good
Yeah.
thing is that I didn't have to make any, other than making travel arrangements. It's not like I had to make funeral arrangements or anything like that, or
Right.
burial arrangements. My mom took care of all the arrangements for my grandfather, and I don't remember if she took care of all the arrangements for my grandma or not. Unfortunately,
Right.
my mom was not able to travel for my grandma. So for my grandpa's passing, I was able to travel.
Yeah.
My mom and I, we were there together, and we
Right.
kind of got each other through it. And then for my grandma's, she was not there, but I have family that was there, and we were, they were very supportive too. So we kind of got through it together in that sense. And then for my partner's grandparents, I felt my role was to make things as easy as possible for her, and
Right.
be there, right, as much as possible, be that shoulder for her to lean on. So we all, and even, and here's the thing, like, grief is not something that just happens and you get over it. It
Right.
happens over time. So we've had to continuously be there and support each other.
Mm.
There's times where she'll have a really tough day, and
Yeah.
something will remind her one of her grandparents, and it'll make her feel very emotional and stuff like that. So I've been, I've tried to help her as much as
Mm.
possible through that stuff, because we both know what it's like
Yeah.
to lose a loved one, right? So
Yeah. Do you feel that you got, because it sounded like you did get a chance, at least, especially with your grandfather, because with your grandmother, it sounds like it was
mhm.
harder with the medical things
Yeah.
that she was dealing with. But do you feel that you at least got the closure to be able to say goodbye to them before they went?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. 100%
I think that
yes.
also helps. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And even going to my dad's mom, that
Right.
visit that we had with the little guy and my dad and all that, and my mom,
Hmm.
um, I was able to say it wasn't goodbye, goodbye,
Right.
but I felt like me going there with one of her great grandkids was a really good last visit with her. And in
Right.
her mind, it probably was the last time, right? I think in her
Hmm.
mind, it would probably she knew it was her time was pretty much up.
Yeah.
Although in my mind, I was still thinking of the next visit in another year or two, So
Right. I'm gonna switch gears a little bit.
let's switch gears.
How do you, you don't get to choose how you die most of the time. Obviously, my mom did, but you don't generally get to. Aside from that, how do you want it done from like your services, funeral, things like that? What would be ideal? If you could attend your own funeral, what would it look like?
Okay. So let's start before the funeral because I've thought about
Okay.
this.
Okay.
If I know that I'm in the process of dying, I
Yeah.
I, I wanna pass away with my loved ones there, or at least the ones that can
Sure.
handle it, right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't want to pass away. I don't feel like I want to pass away alone, which is funny because my grandfather, he was
Hmm.
aware that he was dying,
Right.
and my mom was the last person to see him,
Sure.
and she went in to visit, and he was talking to people that weren't there,
Ah. Yeah.
and and at one point he just waves her off, right? Like,
Hmm.
just go,
Yeah.
and she's like, okay. And then basically it was one of those things where basically, she walked out to the car, she got a call
Yeah.
as soon as she got in the car,
That
and
he had
to
passed.
tell her that he had passed, right? So, you
Yeah.
know, he he probably felt, because he was kind of in the middle of dying, in
Yeah.
his mind, he probably saw his family surrounding
Hmm.
him when he was
Yeah.
passing. So he
I had
probably
a
felt that comfort.
Yeah, I had a grandfather actually that died. Our great grandfather, no grandfather, didn't really know him that well, but I know that he died from cancer, and I know that
Mhm.
right before he kind of went, he was talking same kind of thing. He was talking to people that weren't in the room. Apparently, he was talking
Mhm.
to some poet that was in the corner who had been dead for like 30
Mhm.
years or something like that.
Wow.
So it's kind of
Yeah.
interesting some of the similarities there.
It's a
But
thing,
anyway,
right?
so yeah, so back to
So yeah,
you say you don't
so
want to
I
die
would
alone,
ideally
and
want to pass away, being surrounded by my loved ones.
right,
As far as a service goes, for me, it's more about them,
sure,
and them getting whatever they feel they want to get out of a service. So if they want to do
yeah.
a celebration of life, awesome. If they don't, awesome, right? So for me, it's not
Mhm.
really about how what arrangements I want people to make for me.
Right.
Other than the one thing that I do want is, I do want to be cremated. I
Sure.
don't, I don't really see any point in being buried, um,
Right.
without being cremated. So, that's the only thing the only desire or only wish that I have. But really,
Okay.
I just want them to make whatever is going to help them get through it. How about you?
S- So for me, I've got I don't know, a little bit more thoughts around that. As far as the dying itself part, it's funny. My partner now, who will listen to this, so she'll love the fact I throw it in there. She said that if I need to, she'll sign a contract so that if I'm on my deathbed, she'll lay with me until I die. She said even if for something was to happen and we weren't together anymore, she'd still
Hmm.
do it. And I was like, okay.
Hmm.
So that's kind of funny. So supposedly I won't have to worry about dying alone, at least if I die, that way. Um, from a services point of view, I also would be fine with cremation. I think going through the burial and the casket and all that is, in my opinion, a money waste because I'm dead. I don't
Hmm.
care. Um, I do know that if you do get cremated, but you have a viewing first, whatever you're doing the viewing in, basically, if you're doing a big casket that's expensive, guess what? That's what's getting burned up. So
Yep.
if they do that for
Yep.
me, then buy a cheap one because I'm getting burned up in
Yep.
it. I don't care. Um, as for the services themselves, I've actually had a lot of thought on this. So I would like an old school, like Irish wake, kind of like it's a party. I
Oh
don't want
yeah.
people to be sad. I don't want people to be sad. I want them drinking, having a good time, that kind of thing. That's what I would like to see. Not that I'm condoning the use of alcohol, just saying whatever they decide to do, I want them to have fun with it. Get a comedian in there. I don't care. Again,
Mm-hmm.
I'm all about dark humor. So get somebody to roast me. That would be awesome. Um, and as far as the burial, I always liked the thought from the Vikings, how they did the ship going out and they would set it
Yeah.
on fire. Obviously, there's some legal issues with that. So recently, having a conversation with my partners, we were talking about, well, what we could do is have me just cremate it and then take those ashes and put it on a tiny little boat and set that little tiny boat on fire. So, and I'm like, that's fine. Good enough for me.
A tiny little
So,
boat.
yeah, a little boat. Yeah. So that way nobody gets in
Little
trouble with the law as they try to dispose
boat.
of the ashes. But yeah, so that's kind of the way I think I like to go. Because again, I don't want people can be sad and that's their right, but I don't want to make them any sadder than they need to be if possible. Because, and I guess it depends on how I go, if it's sudden and because I think that's the hardest part with grief for a lot of people when they lose somebody suddenly. It's not, you don't have the opportunity to work through it. It's just boom, that person's gone from your life,
Mm-hmm.
rather than someone who
Right.
dies from a long-term illness. But anyways, so that's me.
All right, so that wraps up today's episode. I know today's episode was probably it was extremely personal for both of us, and hopefully this helps somebody else who may be either coping with the death of a loved one or who may even be dealing with depression or other sorts of issues like that.
Yeah, so I think the next thing, our next episode, we're going to talk about our experiences raising children who are LGBTQ plus and some of the things that we as parents have had to deal with and how we feel best to cope with your children so they can deal with those feelings. So that's it from us. Thank you so much for listening and or watching this. Please comment. We'd love to hear some feedback from everybody. Definitely want to make this an interactive thing. Yeah, that's it. So that's me, Titan.
And Venomous signing off.
Bye.
Bye.